today, there has been many tensions between the Middle East and the Soviet Union, which is now called Russia. There has been tensions, wars, and collapses ever since the Cold War. We can still see these ongoing events nowadays, but after every war there is a piece of tranquility, like the Detente in the 1970s.
In the early 1970s, there was a period of relaxation, which is known as the Detente, a French word meaning release of tensions, where the US had an easing of Cold War tensions not only with the Soviet Union, but also China. In 1968, President Nixon was elected. In the early 1970s, there was an accidental fluke that allowed the US and China to have connections. This took place at the World Championship of Table Tennis in Japan. When a member of the American team accidentally boarded a bus carrying members of the Chinese team, this resulted in the first interaction between both teams. The next day, the captain of the American team proposed to the Chinese captain that they should invite them to play in their country. Mao approved this invitation. The American team became the first from their country to be officially welcomed in decades. This event was followed up by a secret meeting in Beijing, where Kissinger visited Mao in Zhao Enlai. In February of 1972, President Nixon was invited to go to China, and he willingly did. He publicly shook hands with Mao and was toasted in the Great Hall of the People by Zhao. This had a great impact in the easing of tensions between the US and China. Moreover, this called the attention of the Soviet Union. Since China had now connections with the US, the Soviet Union also wanted to have connections with the US. The outcome of this was the SALT Treaty, which means Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, which was an agreement on a partially disarmament of nuclear weapons between the US and the Soviet Union. This treaty was negotiated between President Nixon and Brezhnev in Moscow. Other treaties were signed later on, such as the Helsinki Accord, which recognized political borders, established military confidence, building measures, created opportunities for trade and cultural exchange, and promoted human rights. Later on, Nixon suggested to the Soviets that they should buy American grain, with the intention to win approval from American farmers. A month later, the Soviets started purchasing American grain, negotiating with American. This demonstrated that the USSR could successfully operate in a capitalist relationship. When Ronald Reagan was elected, the presidency passed to someone who never approved the concept of detente. He was running on the concept that the US could not afford to cool off with the Soviet Union. He thought that the Soviets were taking advantage of the detente and emphasized on the military preparedness. Since the US was emphasizing on military preparedness, the Soviets began to do the same thing. This affected their economy in a very negative way, since they did not have the same resources that the Americans had at that time. This is when the detente came to an end. Thank you very much.
The Detente might have been a time of peace, but it affected the Soviet Union economically. This is what made this huge empire go to ruins. There are no clear reasons for why the Soviet Union collapsed. All the minor factors added up and led to this event. The Soviet Union was a totalitarian state with communist leaders. One of the famous ones was Joseph Stalin. During his dictatorship, he introduced his 5-year plan. However, this plan resulted many peasants forced off into industry, decline of food production, and famine and 10 million deaths from starvation. Although Stalin's plan had tragic results, the real collapse began when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev, last leader of the Soviet Union, rose to power. At that time, the Soviet Union was in political and economic danger due to the previous wars and arms race between the United States. So Gorbachev introduced new policy of reform. One of his reforms was policy of glasnost, or freedom of speech, where citizens were allowed to express how they felt about the government. The press, broadcasting, and people used this policy to criticize Gorbachev's failure to improve the economy. He also initiated an economic reform called perestroika, or rebuilding of political and economic system. This reform introduced contested election and ended the price controls because they wanted to create a free market. Despite all of his reforms, the Soviet Union couldn't improve the political and economic crisis. The satellite state of the Soviet Union also had an impact on the collapse, and one of the satellite states is Germany. When the attempt to escape to the west and protests continued to happen in the east, on November 9th, the East government announced the opening of the Berlin Wall.
Deshalb haben wir uns dazu entschlossen, heute eine Regelung zu treffen, die es jedem Bürger der DDR möglich macht, über Grenzübergang.
When the Berlin Wall of Germany dividing the West and East fell and united Germany, the country was no longer communist. Independence of Poland had also impact on the collapse. Poland was also the Soviet Union's satellite state, under communist control. However, this control ended when the John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, was elected as a pope on October 12, 1978. He was from Poland and was the first non-Italian pope in more than 400 years. Election ended the oppression of Catholic religion during the communist control of the Soviet Union, and Poland united together for the religious belief. He also encouraged different church authorities to go against the communist rules and oppressions, which contributed to the founding of Solidarity movement in 1980. Solidarity, an independent trade union movement in Poland that developed in mass campaign for political change and inspired popular opposition to communist regime across Eastern Europe during the 1980s. As Solidarity was gaining more power, the communists felt threatened. In April 1989, Solidarity was legalized and allowed to participate in semi-free election in June 1989. In the election, Solidarity candidates captured all the seats they competed for. At the same time, many prominent communist candidates failed to gain these seats. In 1990, November 11th, Poland engaged in a democratic transition, which put an end to socialist Polish People Republic and led to democratic regime, called the Polish Third Republic, which Lech Walesa, the first popularly elected president of Poland. As democratically elected non-communist government came to power in satellite states such as East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia in late 1989 to late 1990, Gorbachev agreed to withdraw the Soviet troops from those countries and ended the communism. On 29 December 1991, Gorbachev resigned from his position. By January 1992, by popular demand, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. This country was divided into 15 separate independent countries. Boris Yeltsin became the president of Russia that we know today.
The Soviet Union wasn't the only country suffering on the other side of the world. Iraq was going through a crucial fighting against Iran during this time.
On September 22, 1980, Iraq initiated the war against Iran by launching a surprise attack. Iraq's main reason for initiating the war was defensive. The Iraqi government claimed that the Iranian forces were trespassing their border and that the Iranian government was demanding to overthrow their government. The war lasted approximately 8 years when both countries agreed to accept the terms of UN ceasefire resolutions. Iraq went bankrupt after the war. Iraq asked Saudi Arabia and Kuwait to forgive the debt Iraq owed them in exchange of stopping Iran from pushing its way through the Middle East. But they refused. Iraq went further, asking other countries to reduce their quotas so that they can drive up their oil prices to boost up their economy. However, Kuwait did the opposite. They increased their quota by 50%. Kuwait actions made Iraq indignant. Moreover, Iraq believed that Kuwait was trespassing their border, as a result taking oil from them. On August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein decides to invade Kuwait with the intention of canceling the debt Iraq owed Kuwait, obtaining the nation's large oil reserves, and expanding Iraqi power throughout the region. This was the beginning of the Gulf War. The following day, the United Nations ordered Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait, but they refused. So as a result, the United Nations imposed a global ban trade on Iraq. And since the invasion of Iraq also threatened Saudi Arabia, the UN sent troops so that they can prevent the invasion of Iraq. On November 29th, the UN Security Council permitted the attack against Iraq if they didn't withdraw by January 15, 1991. But again, like always, the Iraqi leaders Saddam Hussein refused. So the US and other countries joined together and attacked Iraq by aerial bombings the buildings, weapon plants, oil refineries, communication workers, and roads. The air bombing also destroyed the Iraqi defenses that were located near the border. On February 24th, the US and other Arab countries regained the Kuwait territory. By February 28th, Iraqi forces completely collapsed. Drastic changes occurred after the Gulf War. Palestinians who were living in Kuwait moved out from Kuwait for their safeness. Also, Middle East countries began to have diseases such as chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and gastrointestinal disorder due to depleted uranium and chemical weapons, which affected on newborn children and citizens. Iraq was sanctioned by the UN with financial and trade embargo, which led to poverty and malnutrition. In the late 1990s, the UN was considering to reduce the length of the sanctions because Iraqi people died for not having enough supplies and resources.
Yet Afghanistan had many more problems to come, and this was because of this huge event that happened called the 9/11.
The 9/11 attack occurred on September 11, 2001. This attack was led by a terrorist group called Al-Qaeda. This terrorist group was led by Osama bin Laden, who was soon assassinated 10 years after the 9/11 attacks. During the 9/11, 4 airplanes were hijacked and were aimed for different areas of the United States. 3 of the airplanes stuck their targets. The fourth crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. In a single day, these deliberate attacks of mass murder killed nearly 3,000 human beings from 57 countries. More than 400 of the dead were first responders, including New York City firefighters, police officers, and EMTs. The target areas was the Pentagon. It was successfully hit. The terror group was a result of World War II, when the Jews were sent to Palestine as a safe haven. After World War II, the Jews were sent to Palestine by the UK. Jews began to take more land than was given, and conflicts between Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and other Islamic states arose against the Jews. The Jews had a strong military and were able to fend off the attacking forces. This led to Jews gaining more land and occupying Palestine, commonly known as Israel. As Muslims occupied areas such as the West Bank are some of the few areas occupied and owned by the Muslims. Due to the Jewish invasion, this led to other Muslim countries terrorizing other countries. Soon the Jews took over Palestine, known as Israel today, and left most Arab governments helpless against them. Terrorist groups soon formed to fight against other nations. After the Israeli-Palestinian feud, terror groups were created and started to leave their mark on the world by involving themselves in government affairs illegally and dangerously. Terror groups soon slowly established their power throughout the years, eventually leading to the 9/11. 9/11 was a very emotional, tremendous turning point in the history of the United States. This led to the War of Terror that George W. Bush established after the terrorist group Al-Qaeda invaded the US and attacked sites on American soil. 9/11 was the first attack on the United States since World War II, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Now in New York City, where the World Trade Center used to be, a memorial was made to mourn and remember those who have died on that day. The US sent special forces to assassinate Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. The strike force was successful in the assassination and managed to cripple Al-Qaeda.
9/11 will be an event that will always be remembered in history. The terrorist attack infuriated many people, and many people wanted justice. George W. Bush held office during this attack, and he and his administration declared war on terrorism on October 7, 2001. This was about 2 months after the attack on the Twin Towers. However, before the attack was declared, Bush demanded that he wanted the Taliban to turn in bin Laden.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
The Taliban said that they did not want to turn him in unless they had proof that it was actually him. This left no choice to Bush than to declare war. Some changes were made to protect the country from any future attacks. One of them being the great improvement of Homeland Security, which is a clearinghouse that obligates the federal enforcement agencies to share information in order to stop threats faster. Airports also underwent through a huge change. Security checks became more strict and more invasive in order to track any possible bombs. During the wartime, the United States, with the help of 23 other nations, drove the Taliban, a terrorist group, from political power, which began to destroy Al-Qaeda's grip on Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda's terrorist financing networks and operations were also shut down, and also were the terrorist training camps. This war has been compared to the Cold War for many reasons. One of them being that in both wars, America had tensions and threats from foreign countries. Advertisement was also a great factor in these two wars. Media displayed going to war and fight against another country was okay and it had to be done. Some even argue that similarities go as far as that both created jobs for both wars, which helped the economy rise. This war is still going on around today. Terrorists still exist even if some argue that it ended when the war in Afghanistan ended. Terrorism is all over the world and it became a constant fight against it. We have to stop it.